Welcome back. I'm Pastor Mitchell, and whether you are new to APBC or you've been around for a while, I want to say thanks for watching today. You know, as a church, we exist to lead people to trust in and follow Jesus, and we do that by creating opportunities and environments for you to connect with God, with other people, and with the world. Some of those key opportunities are highlighted on the front end of this video. Some of them you'll find on our Facebook page, but wherever you're at in your faith journey, we hope that you find a way to engage with what we're doing as a church. And if at any time you have any questions about faith or what we do together, simply drop me an email at mitchell.deware@gmail.com, and I would love to be able to connect with you. Now, I hope that today's message both encourages and inspires you in taking your next step in trusting in and following Jesus.
So we'll begin with a question this morning, and it's maybe perhaps a short question, but might not have a short answer. The question is this, and you don't need to answer it out loud, but what makes somebody great? What makes somebody great? Now, as you think about that, there's probably all kinds of answers that we could give to what makes somebody great. If you were to chase greatness and achieve greatness, what would that look like? And of course, it being Super Bowl Sunday, you didn't figure you'd get away without some kind of football reference, right? So when we think about chasing greatness, I mean, the first thing that came to mind for me as I was preparing for this morning is just Tom Brady at the moment, right? The GOAT, the greatest of all time when it comes to football. And you think about some of the stats. I mean, I could give you a whole list of them for today, but did you know that today marks after today, he will have appeared in 18% of every NFL Super Bowl ever played. Isn't that crazy? Like almost 1 in 5 Super Bowls Tom Brady will have played in. And not only that, he is doing so this year with a team, a brand new team that he joined over the spring and into the summer, that last year had a losing record of 7-9, right? And so now he has brought them to this point where they're going to be playing for the Super Bowl. And for Brady himself, it's going to be, if they win today, his 7th Super Bowl ring. Now that is ridiculous in terms of any sporting event, in football itself, but any sporting event. So this is just something, when you think about greatness, when it comes to NFL and sports and achievement, he is right there, right? There's a reason why he's called the GOAT. If that doesn't do it for you, maybe you can think back to the late 80s in the city of Edmonton, and Messier and Curry and Gretzky, right? And you remember those guys, right? And all the chasing of the greatness in the NHL and the Stanley Cups that they all won. And I actually had a friend who lived in Edmonton during that time, and she told me, she said it was fascinating because she kind of had this little, I don't think she was really much of a hockey fan or maybe a Gretzky fan either, but she would say, she said, you know what? Those guys, they would be together and they'd be walking down the street of Edmonton just like they owned the place, like they were something. And I looked at her and said, because they were, right? Like, in terms of the NHL, they were something, right? And she kind of took a step back. She's like, no, you're not getting it. And I'm like, no, you're not getting it. Like, so there's like this, this thing, right? But when you think about greatness, what is it? Maybe that's not something that you think of when you think of being great or somebody achieving greatness. And in fact, there's probably a difference between what's, being great and achieving something great, right? Because just because you achieve something great doesn't necessarily mean that you are great. It just means that you achieved something great. And so what is it that makes a person great? What is it that when you think about greatness in your life and my life and the lives of any other human being, what would it be that would make that person great? And we might even, again, come up with all kinds of different answers. We might tie it to somebody's accomplishments and what they've been able to achieve. We might tie it to some kind of power or position or some kind of status that they find themselves having. And maybe perhaps it is a certain level of wealth or number of followers I mean, we could define greatness probably in all kinds of ways. But here's the thing about greatness and about being great that I'm sure is true of all of us, is I don't know too many people who wake up in the morning and put their feet on the floor and say, I just want to be mediocre today. Right? I want to be halfway today. I just want to be average today, like let's aim for that. I don't know too many people who would wake up and say, that's what we want to do. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to be done with my life, is I just kind of be mediocre or average. And so today, as we engage with the Gospel of Mark, here's what's going to happen. We're going to get a front row seat to a discussion, actually a few discussions and a few different events where Jesus defines greatness for us, and he tells us what it actually means to be great. Now, last week we left off in part 5 with Jesus taking his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. Remember that? And while they're there, he asks them, who do people say that I am? And they say, well, some say you're Elijah, some say John the Baptist. There's all kinds of answers. And he says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter makes this confession. Jesus, we believe you're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're God's chosen one. And this is what we believe about you, that you are the great one, as it were. And so now, following this declaration by Peter, there's a shift in the mood and in the narrative of Mark's gospel and the way that Jesus interacts with his disciples, because it's immediately after this that Jesus essentially tells them, I'm not going to be great, at least not in the way that you're thinking I'm going to be great. In fact, the thing that he begins to tell them is that what's going to happen is we're going to make our way to Jerusalem, and when I get there, I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests and to the scribes. I'm going to be ridiculed. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be mocked. I'm going to suffer. I'm eventually going to be killed. But I want you to know this, he says, that 3 days later, I am going to rise again from the dead. And so as they're making their way, now, Jesus has already told them this. There's been a few things that have happened. By the time we get to verse 30 of Mark chapter 9, we find Jesus a second time telling his disciples the very same thing. And when we get to Jerusalem, I'm going to be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and I'm going to be killed. But I want you to know that 3 days later, I am going to raise from the dead. This is the second time that Jesus has now told his disciples this very thing. And by the time we get to verse 32 of chapter 9, here's what happens. It says, but they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. So the disciples, even though they've heard Jesus say this once, and now this is the second time he's telling them this, and there's been some discussions along the way in between as well, they still did not understand. Even after Jesus has talked to them about these things openly, he's answered questions, he's explained things. In fact, Peter, James, and John as well have gone up onto the mountain and have this experience of Jesus where he's transfigured before them, right? And they have a discussion about this whole experience. And even after all of these things, they still don't understand. And not only that, but they're afraid to ask Jesus about it again. Why? Remember what happened last time Jesus said this to them? The first time that he told them, this is what's going to happen when we get to Jerusalem? What did Peter do? He pulled Jesus aside and he said to him privately, he said, Lord, this is not how it's going down. Right? Like, this can't be the way. And Jesus looked at Peter and just rebuked him sharply. It's some pretty strong words for Peter. He says, get behind me, Satan, you adversary. Why? Because you don't have on your mind the will and the desire and the things of God. In fact, your statement about what I should be and what I should be doing is actually contrary to the will and plan and desire of God. And so listen, you guys got to understand this is what's going to happen. But they don't want to ask him about it when he says it again, because they know what happened last time, and they get the sense that we should probably know and we should probably get it, but we just don't want to get it wrong. And so they're afraid to ask. And so then Mark tells us that they keep walking on their way to Capernaum. And when they came to Capernaum, and he was with them in the house, they've arrived in the town, Capernaum, kind of the north shore of Sea of Galilee. They go into the house where they're staying, and Jesus asks his disciples a question. He says, what were you discussing on the way? I heard you guys kind of whispering and not talking too loud, but loud enough that I kind of knew, and I could see that you're talking about things. You kind of had those glances and those looking at each other. Like, what was it you were talking about on the way? But then Mark says, but they kept silent. They didn't want to reveal. They didn't want to say, well, this is what our conversation was about, right? We're still embarrassed about this, and we're afraid of what you might tell us if you do know what we were talking about. So we're just not going to say. And so they kind of give Jesus the silent treatment. And the reason why is because on the way they'd argued with one another about who was the greatest. Who's the greatest? So they get caught in this kind of comparison game between each other. Well, I'm more gifted in this way. Well, yeah, well, did you see my answer to Jesus' question? I'm pretty sure I got it right. Well, the rest of you didn't say anything at all. And do you remember that moment? Oh, yeah, and remember when he called you, man, your history as a tax collector, as a political zealot, like, man, you've got some stuff you got to deal with, and I'm just kind of leaps and bounds ahead of you. And look, when Jesus sets up the kingdom, this is how I think it's all going to be divvied up, and the responsibilities we're going to have, and who's going to have the best seats in the house, and who's going to be in charge of what, right? And so they're kind of all building their own case about how they've one-upped each other and why they feel that they are kind of the greatest among the 12 who are closest to Jesus. And so they don't want to tell him this, but the reason is because this. Now Jesus knows kind of the conversation, and so here's what Mark tells us happens. And Jesus sat down, which was a typical posture for a teacher. So when the teacher is about to say something, the teacher would sit down. So Jesus sits down and calls the 12 around them, and he says to them, and this is the secret. This is kind of the thing. If you want to be great, this is how Jesus defines it. He says, if anyone would be first, if you're going to be the most prominent, you're going to rise to the top, if you're going to be, the greatest, he must be last of all and servant of all. Now, in any kind of regular definition of greatness, isn't this backwards? Like, doesn't that just turn everything on its head? Right? When you think of kind of what would be noted as the greatest person or the qualities of the greatest person, you think about who maybe the greatest person is. I mean, stuff that immediately comes to mind is people who are at the top of the pile. Right? People who've achieved some kind of status or success, or they've achieved something in life that makes them worthy of being called great. And Jesus says to them, look, it's not really about kind of the status that you achieve. In fact, if you want to be great, then here's the way to be great, is to work really hard at becoming the least and becoming the servant of anybody and of everybody. And that's the secret to greatness. And then Jesus says this, that Jesus then called a little child and you put him in the midst of them. Now, the word that's used here for child is not really a word that we typically use for infant. It's kind of the next stage after infancy, right? So we're not talking like 12, 13-year-old kid. We're not talking about, kind of a few months old. We're talking kind of that, 2, 3, 4, maybe 7 years old, like just a young child. And so Jesus brings this young child and sets him in the midst of him, and he takes this kid up in his arms, and he's holding him, and he says to his disciples, right after he lands this statement on them, he says, whoever receives or welcomes in one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Now don't miss what's going on here. Jesus says, look, if you want to be greatest, you want to work to be last of all and servant of all, because that's the posture you need to take. And anyone who receives such a child, a little one who hasn't achieved anything of great value, right, in terms of any kind of definition of success or greatness, somebody who's wholly dependent on someone else, somebody who has the lowest position. And Jesus says, if you're going to welcome this kind of child in my name, look, here's what happens. In doing so, you welcome me. You're kind of in my company. And not only that, but whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And what's he saying? He's saying this. Look, as you welcome the smallest, right, and those who are not by any kind of standard definition the greatest, you are in fact welcoming. It's a welcome for God himself. You will be in the company of God Almighty by the way that you welcome and treat others. Now, there's a whole lot more to this conversation as it unfolds, which we're going to pick up at another time in one of the evening services. But Jesus here lands a statement on, look, you want to be great. You're going to be last of all. You're going to be servant of all. And he just flips the whole definition on its head. Now, later on, when they leave Caesarea Philippi, they keep traveling south because they're on their way to Jerusalem, right? They've left Caesarea Philippi way up north. They've come down as far as Capernaum. Now they're going to keep going south. And in chapter 10, we read that Jesus comes into the region of Judea, which is just kind of that region around Jerusalem. So he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds were gathered to him again. And so again, everywhere Jesus went, crowd begins to gather. And as was his custom, he begins teaching the crowd. And so they're getting nearer to Jerusalem. But again, Jesus has a run-in with some of the religious elites, the scribes, those who are considered great in terms of religion and their understanding of God's law and all of these things, right? And so the greatness and culturally shows up to engage Jesus in a conversation. And here's what happens. They ask him a question. The Pharisees came in and wanted to test him, right? They want to kind of put the pressure on, because remember, they're looking for a way to discredit him and his ministry and his words. And if they can pit Jesus against Moses and against the law, then they've got a way to say, look, he's broken the law, he's guilty, we can do away with him. And so they come to Jesus and they ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Is it legally okay? Can we get away with just divorcing our wives? Is it legal to do that according to the law? And the reference here is not just kind of the legal standard in terms of the nation, which is what it is, but that legal standard was dependent on the law given to Moses at Sinai from God himself. Right? So this isn't just a question of, who made up whatever law for our nation. It is, what does God have to say? Is it lawful? Is it okay for us to just simply divorce our wives and get away with it? Now here's the thing that comes to the surface. I'll just throw this out here for us, because this is, I think, helpful for us even today, is that just because something is lawful, right, in our nation, in our country, just because something is lawful or because it's legal or because there's a rule that says it's okay, doesn't always mean that it's beneficial. You ever notice that? Just because something is legally okay doesn't necessarily mean it's beneficial or always good. But what's being discussed here is, when it comes to God's law and what God has to say, is it lawful? Is it legal? Is it okay for a man to simply divorce his wife? Now, fascinatingly enough, Mark doesn't give us the full question. Matthew actually tells us a little bit more about the question that they actually asked Jesus. It's the same question, only there's a little more, it's expanded a bit more. According to Matthew, the question is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? You see what's going on here? For any and every reason. Can I just come up with a reason on my own and just divorce my wife? And in fact, and I think I've told you this before, that there's actually literature where the rabbis, where teachers of the law would debate over what was what was a kind of a good reason for divorcing one's wife. And if she burnt supper on Friday night, was that a good enough reason? Right? Like, today, you complain about the supper, it's like, you can go get your own. Right? You go make your own supper. You go to the McDonald's, or you do whatever you want, and you either eat what's in front of you and be happy about it, or figure it out, right? And so there's not really a question of, well, I'm just going to put you away. That's it. We're going to dissolve the whole thing, because it didn't turn out like Mama made it. Right? So here's the question. Can a man divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, and Jesus kind of throws the question back to them in some ways, and this is what he says in verse 3. He answered them, well, what does Moses command you? What is written in the law? What does the law actually say? If you want to have a question about the law, well, let's go back to the law. And what is it that the law says? In fact, what is it that God has said as he gave the law at Sinai in the eyes of God? What's the answer to the question? And so they respond to Jesus by saying this. Look, Moses, right? Moses allowed a man. Now catch the slight nuance difference Jesus says, what did Moses command you? But their response is what Moses allowed, what he permitted. Not what he commanded, but what he allowed and permitted. He says, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to simply send her away. So what did Moses command was the question Jesus asked, and their response is essentially, as long as you make it official, as long as you get the right paperwork in order, as long as you can get their certificate signed and filled out and legally tidied up and the I's dotted and the T's crossed and all the jots and tittles are in order and in place, as long as everything goes according to how it's supposed to go in the paperwork, then it is permissible. It's allowed to happen. Now, here's the thing about that culture. And the reason why the question is asked, can a man divorce his wife? It's kind of twofold reason why it's worded in that way. One is simply because it's the men that are asking the question here, right? They're asking, can we send away our wives, right? And not the other way around. And the reason is because in that day and age, only men really had the legal right to make that kind of decision in that society. So let's not kind of get tripped up and thinking, well, this is just a men only or a woman only. Like it can be either or here, right? So what is legal? What is lawful? What did Moses command? And Jesus says, what is written in the law? And they say, well, here's what Moses allowed to happen. And then Jesus kind of digs into the heart of the issue, quite literally. He said to them, it's because of your hardness of heart he wrote you this commandment. It's because of something going on in you that he wrote this commandment. It's because of something happening in you that he made it permissible. It's because of something happening in your soul that has spilled over into your relationship with your spouse. It's your own stubbornness, right, that's brought you to the place. So the problem, essentially, Jesus says here in veiled terms, the problem is not your wife, it is you. You being stubborn. You looking for a reason. You looking for a way out. You blaming her, and the reality of the issue that's going on is about your own hardness of heart. And that's the only reason why Moses wrote that commandment. It's because sin wrecks stuff. Sin causes issues and problems, right? And that finds its way into marriage relationships as well. And so Moses gave a concession or a permission as a result of the issue of sin and how it destroys marriages. That's why Moses wrote it. So no, for any and every reason, look, you shouldn't be looking for that. Here's actually what Jesus goes on to say about marriage, and this is absolutely fascinating. He says, but from the beginning, haven't you heard? If you go back to the beginning, before Sinai, before the law, before certificates of divorce, before any of those kinds of things, right? From the beginning of creation, let's start way back at that part of the story, before sin entered the world. What did God do? God made them male and female. Adam and Eve, that is the beginning of the creation story, that God made one man and one woman, right? He made them male and female, and that therefore a man will leave his father and his mother and hold fast to or cling to or cleave to his wife. Which, by the way, this is a comment on Jesus' definition of what marriage should be, right? So he says, a man will leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, male and female, and the two will become what? One flesh. There's something significant, he says, about the union of two people in marriage, that it's two become one, that there's a mingling of souls that happens here. There is something so significant about the marriage relationship that it goes beyond kind of contracts and certificates and kind of agreements and all that kind of stuff. That is, like, if we just think about marriage, right, as something I sign up for or sign on to, that we can just kind of dissolve that away whenever we want, whenever she burns supper or whenever, he does something. Like if that's how we treat the marriage relationship, Jesus is saying we've got our definition and our understanding of marriage all wrong. But that's not how we should view it. The two become one flesh. It's something significant that happens here. And so they're no longer two, but one flesh. And whatever God has joined together, let no man separate or put a space between, undo, unone. The word adulterate means to literally tear apart at the seams. And whenever something gets torn apart or adulterated, it hurts. Because it rips and it pulls and it tears and it snags. Right? And so what is Jesus doing here? He's saying, look, there's allowances. Right? Moses gave allowances, and he's even going to say here, like there are allowances for divorce. There's allowances, there's room for that, but it's because of the hardness of heart that people experience in that relationship. It's where sin irrevocably damages a marriage relationship. But Jesus' emphasis is not on looking for the way out. His emphasis is on we need to come back around what marriage is and what you and your spouse are as you join together and the two become one flesh. He goes on, chapter 10, verse 13. We read this other fascinating thing. And they were bringing children to Jesus that he might lay his hands on them to touch them and to pray for them. And his disciples rebuked them. So now, after this kind of confrontation with the Pharisees, and they're kind of backing away because of what Jesus has said, right? Now people begin to bring their children to Jesus, say, "Would you just pray for them? Would you bless them?" Right? And what do the disciples do? And it's fascinating, right? Because their immediate response is to rebuke these parents and say, "No. Like, time out. Jesus is here with the crowd. You've got a limited amount of time. He's a great man. There's all kinds of great people that he needs to see. And so these little children, as much as you love them and care for them, he's got to spend the right amount of time in the company of the right people." Now, has this anywhere ever at any point been an indication of the ministry of Jesus? Has this been a pattern that his disciples have seen him, have so far? No. In fact, in the beginning, not that long ago before this, what did Jesus do? He took a little child and set it in front of them, and he said, "Look, hey, you want to be great? You gotta serve. You gotta get to the bottom. You gotta serve everyone. You gotta be the least. You gotta aim for the lowest point that you be able to give your life toward other people." And so he uses the illustration of this child that he sets in front of them, and now people are bringing their children to Jesus, and he's just like, the disciples are like, "No, send them away. They don't need to be here. And you know what? We don't really have time for this." But Jesus gets indignant and angry and incensed over the whole thing. And he says to them this, "Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it." And he took them in his arms, that is the children, and he blessed them, and he laid his hands on them, and he prayed for them. To bless them means to speak well of and to pray for these children who are coming in full dependence, in full humility, in full trust. And Jesus says, you want to be great? We got to welcome the such as these. And then he goes on. It's fantastic. It's fascinating. Again, another story, which we don't have all the time to kind of dive into all the nuances about it, but it's a story that if you grew up in church, you're probably familiar with. And there's a young man who comes to Jesus and says, "Hey, teacher, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? Because the only person who's really good is God himself, right? Why are you calling me good?" But then he asks him a question. He says, "Well, what's written in the law? What did Moses command? What are the commands, right? Here's what you got to do. You don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false." He lists a bunch of the commands to this young man, and the young man looks at Jesus and says, "Hey, I've kept all those since I was a kid. Like, in terms of my achieving, accomplishing, fulfilling the law, I've done really great with this. I've been right there with the best of them. Like I've kept these commands since I was really young." And that Jesus, it says, he looked at him and loved him. And I love that Mark adds that Jesus looks at this guy with compassion and with esteem and with well-wishing. He wants what's best for him. So he looks at him, he loves him, and he says to him, "Well, you lack something. There's something missing." He says, "Go and sell all that you have and give it to the poor, and then you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." It says to go and liquidate all your assets, give it to those who need it, and then follow me. Because really, what have we heard Jesus say so far? What does it profit anyone to gain the whole world and to forfeit their own soul? Right? What good is it if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul? If you're going to follow me, you got to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And the young man, upon hearing what Jesus had to say, went away sad. Why? Because he had many possessions that they were hard to let go of. Because something else that Jesus said also rings true here is that where your treasure is, there your heart will be. With what you've accumulated, what you've achieved, what you're going after, right? Where that treasure is, that's where your heart, where your loyalty is going to lie. And Jesus says you have to be willing to give it all up to come and to follow me. And then he tells his disciples it is going to be really difficult. It doesn't say impossible, but it's going to be really difficult for someone who's rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Why? Because it's really hard to let go of our securities and the things that we trust in for our own well-being. Because where your treasure is, again, that's where your heart is going to be. And so let me land with this morning. And so I want us to see kind of thematically, because that's the way we've been approaching this, right? Thematically, with how all these things, all these events, all these encounters, how do they all fit together? And here's what I see in all of it. If you want to be great, you've got to work your way to the bottom. Now again, that sounds so counterintuitive. It sounds so counterculture. It sounds like nothing that you'll read in any kind of textbook or life plan or all the rest. But if you want to be great, you've got to work your way to the bottom. And you know what that's going to require? It's going to require you to trust God a whole lot more than you will trust yourself. If you want to be great, you got to work your way to the bottom. So here's what it looks like. What is it that we can do to be great? If we want to be great, according to Jesus, what does that look like? Well, I would say be selfless. Be selfless. Consider others as more important than yourself. Take time for other people. Work for their good. Because here's the thing about selfishness, right? Selfishness will actually ruin, eventually, every relationship that you ever have. Isn't that true? The more selfish you are, the greater the capacity to ruin every single relationship that you have with somebody else. And so Jesus says, you want to be great? Look, you got to be the servant of all. You got to work your way to the bottom. You got to be selfless. You got to think about yourself a whole lot less and think about other people more. And look, how does this play out? Well, let's talk about some kind of the practical areas of life that if we want to be great, here's how we can do that. Think about your marriage and your kids, or, just for those of you who are married and have kids, right? Think about that. If you want to be great at your marriage and be great with your kids. And if you're a kid, be great with your parents, right? Like those relationships. If you want to achieve greatness and you're married and you got kids or you got parents, be great in the context of that relationship. And here's the thing that I know and have seen is true. If you're looking for a way out of any of those things, you will eventually find one. If you're looking for the any and every reason, you will eventually find one. Now listen, and don't. So here's the thing. We can't get into a whole extended conversation about this morning. So just don't run with what I say here and make some major life-changing decision for yourself over this next week. But listen, divorce, when it comes to marriage and divorce, right? Divorce is never desirable. It's never something that we should ever aspire to, want, look for. I don't know anybody that ever got married and said, yeah, we're thinking, a year in, we'll probably call it quits, right? Like the idea is this is a together for a life thing. And so divorce is never desirable. And in fact, we are for marriage and we'll always be for marriage and for marriage being great and for all of those things. But listen, sinfulness can irrevocably damage a marriage. It absolutely can. And there are times and there are places when that can happen. And there's a difference between an unhealthy relationship and an unhappy relationship. Right? There's a difference in those things. And so in the New Testament, we read about all kinds of things that are just absolutely devastating and damaging to a relationship. And it's not that you can never come back from them, but man, it gets really, really hard. And some of those are adultery, desertion, and abuse. Right? So when those things are happening, those are unhealthy. That's not just an unhappy relationship. It is an unhealthy relationship. And there's some serious work that needs to be done. But Jesus' emphasis when it comes to marriage and that relationship is on the fact, look, how can we make it better? How can we make it work? We need to go back to the original intention and design and invest in that. And here's what I've discovered is that so often that it's not really the question that we ask really about how can we make it work. We just kind of hope it does. If we're not intentional about the ways that we make those relationships work, whether it's with our marriage, whether it's with our kids, whether it's about somebody else, like if we're not going to be intentional about that, and we're just going to hope that it all works out, man, we're just kind of setting ourselves up for a long, hard struggle along the way. And so we want to work on it, and I'll just throw this out there to kind of cling to as well, because I think this could be a game changer for so many people, that in marriage you need to be not just committed to your marriage, but you need to be committed to your spouse. Right? Because how many people have you run into, or you know, that 30, 40, 50 years in, man, we're committed to marriage. We're committed to marriage. We're committed to this marriage. This marriage is never gonna end. But they live in separate rooms with a house and fight constant and never go to dinner together. And it's really not a marriage. We're committed to marriage, not to my spouse. Because when you got married, you didn't marry marriage, you married your spouse. And so the idea is that, man, we got to invest in that relationship and be committed to our spouse. So we want to be great, be selfless. Be committed to your marriage. And not only that, but think about your possessions and your status and your achievements and all the things that we chase day in and day out, and what we hope for and what we long for and what we're working hard towards. Look, we can't trust our possessions for things they can't provide. And Jesus says to us, look, where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. And so you got to start putting your treasure and your investment into eternal things, into things that last longer than this life, that aren't going to rust and wear out and rot and get destroyed or maybe stolen. Look, we want to invest in things of eternal value. And at the end of the day, greatness is measured not by how much you achieve, but by how much you give away.